I invite you to rise in body or spirit for the reading of the gospel. This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she might be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him, except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. And this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. I invite you to be seated. About 15 years ago, I went on my first backpacking trip. I was staying at Rainbow Trail Lutheran Camp in Colorado, and they have a program where you spend half the week out on the mountains. I'd never done this before. I had a couple friends who had done this a lot, and we were there with my church youth group. And the night before we were to leave and get up onto the mountains, where we would spend several days and nights, they taught us how to pack a backpack. And, they were like, "Hey, you really got to think carefully about exactly what you need. And by the way, even if you think you need these things, you can't take them because, there are bears and stuff, and all of these kinds of rules." And I remember thinking really long and hard about packing my backpack, and then I thought I had it ready, and they were like, "Hey, wait, everybody make sure there's room in your backpack for all of the community goods. All the pots and pans, the food, the tents, the things that are going to be good for everybody. They would serve you too, but somebody has to carry them, right? And all of your stuff. So we spread them out evenly among people. And there was not a single one of us that did not have to take at least one thing out. Even my really good friend Matt, who is an Eagle Scout and had been on so many trips, when we started divvying up all the community stuff, he's like, all right, got to take this shirt out or whatever, right? Like, now he had less to take out than I did. But everybody had to go back and reconsider what it was that they needed to take out and set aside that they really didn't need for this trip, for the things that everybody really needed that would help us have enough to eat and shelter and a place to be warm. Coffee. I didn't really drink coffee at 16, but every one of us had to change what we were doing. And, it was a good thing, too. It was a good thing, too, because I ended up carrying a few extra items on that first day's hike because some of our members, that first day was the longest day and the steepest amount of incline, and there were some of our folks who were ready to turn around. And one of the things we did to help keep them going, including encouraging them and all this kind of stuff, is we said, hey, all that community stuff in your backpack, can somebody else carry it? So it was a good thing that I left a little bit of room, that I really thought long and hard about exactly what I would need and tried to take only those things. I learned a few things. I want to tell them to you. I needed less than I thought I needed, right? I learned that I needed less than I thought I needed. I learned it a few times packing that backpack. And then I feel like I even probably was up there on the mountain and was like, I didn't need to bring this. You ever get that on a trip? You're like, I didn't need to bring this. The group of us shared the burden of caring for one another and carrying the things we all needed. Everybody carried something, and then each did as they were able. Right? Some carried more and some carried less. Some carried heavier things and some carried lighter things. And some, at certain points, carried none of the community stuff at all. We shared that burden so that we could all make the journey. Everyone had to reconsider their needs and what they were able to carry so that everyone could make sure everyone had enough. You also had to be able to keep your hands free and your arms open. You couldn't hold too many things in there because you never knew what exactly was coming next, which part of the path you might need to use your arms and legs for, who might need a helping hand, all of that. When you might need a helping hand. And it was important to slow down. If we walked at a slower pace that everyone could make, the whole group traveled faster. We could make it farther that way. We could make it together that way. We were also way more able to enjoy the journey and one another's company when we slowed down a little bit. As the world is moving toward the end of this pandemic, and many of us are traveling, I myself am just back from vacation, right? A quick little road trip, and I seem to have forgotten these lessons on how to travel light. I could blame my kids, but it's not all their fault, at least. Though they do seem to need a few more outfits than I do. We seem to be picking up and traveling for the first time in more than a year, and maybe you've forgotten some of this too. Not only might we be packing a bit too much for our first trips, but it seems to me like most of us are carrying a heavier burden than normal. We've been through a lot. The toll of these last months is yet to be fully measured. You may have heard me say before, the lightning of this pandemic has hit, but I don't think we've quite heard the rumble of the thunder yet. But we already know some of the toll that this has taken on us, all of us. Increased rates of depression and anxiety, a large amount of grief, the effects of trauma and loneliness. Not to mention, there are things we're struggling to bring with us into the future that weren't serving us that well in the past. Like an old, large piece of luggage that's weighing you down. It was made before they put wheels on your bags. It has some fond memories. Or perhaps someone told you, this is the only bag you'll ever need. And you're going to need it forever. But it was made for a world that no longer exists, for a time that we're no longer in. And during these next few weeks, we'll be exploring what it means to travel light and taking a close look at those things that we might be trying to drag with us that we really just need to set down so that we can walk forward faithfully. Some of those things might be physical things that are holding you back, like the things and the stuff that clutter up my house, or the few extra things that we stuffed in our car that could barely carry the stuff home. Some of it's stuff, and some of it is the weightiness of these last months, or ways that we were living that don't make sense anymore. Now, there are beautiful things that we want to carry with us. But I think that, like my experience packing my backpack, there might be a couple fewer of those things than we first think there are. As we talk about traveling light, we're going to look at Jesus. Jesus did a lot of traveling, right? He always seemed to be going somewhere, coming from somewhere. Today, he's crossing seas and borders and boundaries. He is on the move. Jesus keeps on going and traveling to share the gospel and bring wholeness to a broken and hurting creation. In our gospel reading today, Jesus has just crossed over and he's met by this big crowd and by a highly respected member of society, someone with relatively high social standing, Jairus, the synagogue leader, whose daughter is in urgent need of help. He sets out toward the synagogue leader's house when a woman of no social standing or status, who's given all of her money away, who is sick and has been marginalized because her body has been hemorrhaging for 12 years, presses into the crowd with nothing but her faith that Jesus will make her well. A few things from this story about traveling from Jesus. Jesus does not lose himself in the busyness, and he is ready for interruptions. There's time for the interruption and for the destination. There's time for this woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years and for this 12-year-old little girl. Jesus also looks on the strangers he meets, both the synagogue leader and this woman, and many of those in the crowd, with love. And Jesus takes the time to make things right. When this woman touches his cloak, he stops and he makes sure that there's not just physical healing, but that there is spiritual healing. Because so often in the ancient world, and sometimes today, we think that moral and spiritual failures lead to physical illness or hurt or disability. But it's not true, and Jesus takes the time to restore that and to reconnect her with the society, calling her his daughter, praising her faith. And a few things about not just traveling, but traveling light from the gospel. Jesus does not show deference or partiality for the synagogue leader, even though his situation is urgent and he's an important dude. He gets a name. Not everybody in the Bible that Jesus interacts with gets a name. This is Jairus. Jesus sets aside the distinctions and hierarchies that have marginalized the woman and that have lifted up the synagogue leader in favor of bringing wholeness and life and love to the whole world, to everyone, to all of them. He has enough time for both of them. He sets down ideas of partiality and social status and ideas like, well, let me help them first because they're more important. Or, don't worry about her, she doesn't really matter. They all matter. This woman is a daughter of great faith, a daughter of God, just as the synagogue leader's daughter is a daughter and a daughter of God. Also, Jesus is willing to kind of let go of his agenda to some extent. He's going to preach the good news. He's going to go where he needs to go. Nothing's going to stop him from bringing healing and wholeness. And sometimes that work breaks in and might interrupt, what we would call his to-do list, right? He's on the way to heal Jairus' daughter, and this other woman shows up. Jesus sets aside the idea of we've got to get there. This always in a rush, going mentality that can so easily grip us. He doesn't get lost in his busyness, but takes the time to listen, love, heal, and bring shalom, right? The disciples are like, how are you talking about people touching you? Everybody's touching you, Jesus. The whole crowd is pushing in against you. And Jesus says, no. There's something important that needs to happen here because this woman was made well. And not only was she made well, but she needs to know that she is also spiritually well, that she is worthy because God has made her, because she is a beloved child of God, and that she needs to be reconnected to this crowd. Also, Jesus doesn't let the crowds dictate what he does and what he's willing to do. He's willing to walk away from the crowds again and again. He leaves them outside. He leaves them multiple times in this story. He's got all these people following, and he's like, all right, I got to go over here and do this thing. It's not always about what the fame or popularity you might gain. It isn't always about pleasing the masses. It is always about doing God's will, proclaiming the gospel and bringing God's reign of shalom. So, how do we travel light? How do we travel light? We'll talk about this in these next few weeks, but here's a few quick things. We steep ourselves in the way of Jesus, who carries our burdens and invites us to lay them down and to share them with one another, to give voice to them, like in Lamentations. We slow down a bit. We take notice of God all around you. We worry less about getting our entire to-do list done and worry more about loving your neighbor. You can travel light when you spend less energy trying to please the people at the top and more time getting to know those on the margins. In fact, try and notice anytime you're assigning more value to someone because they have more, or they have it all together, or have a position of power, or fame, or wealth, or celebrity. Set that aside so that you remember the worth of every beloved child of God, so that you remember your own worth, because you are of immense value to God, and Jesus has time for you too. And then there are two great faith practices from our readings today. One is lament, from Lamentations, to lament, to cry out about injustice or hurt, to give voice to our pain and anger and sorrow, to yearn for the world to change, to look more like God's kingdom, to pray that heaven might come down to earth, that God's will might be done, to put words and feelings and emotions to our burdens, and to know that when there aren't words, the Spirit intercedes with groans. Lament, especially when we do it together, can help us travel light. And in 2 Corinthians, did you catch that story of generosity? I tell people, that's the only stewardship sermon that the church has ever needed. Paul in 2 Corinthians. Consider what you have. When you have an abundance, give from it so that others' needs might be met and that their abundance might meet your needs. But here's the thing about giving and generosity. Generosity can help us to travel light. Not just because it means you won't buy more stuff to clutter up your home, but it often does mean that too. Being generous with your time can help you realize you really do have enough time for the things that matter most. Being generous with your money helps you realize you don't always have to be afraid that you won't have enough. Be generous with your heart and your love and realize that despite the sometimes popular opinion that the more you give away, the less you'll have to give to the next person. And yes, knowing that you will get hurt and burned if your heart is that open to everyone. When you're generous with your love, you realize that love is an ever-renewing resource. And the more you give, the more you seem to have to give away. Friends, this is certainly true. God is calling us forward. God is calling us to live the way of Jesus. God is moving us toward more abundant life and love. God is doing a new thing in and through you. As we look to take that next right faithful step in following Jesus, let's not burden ourselves unnecessarily. Let's not drag those things that should have been left behind a long time ago. Let's lament and grieve. Let's slow down and take stock of what we really need and what we need to lovingly say thank you and goodbye, for now at least. Let's step out in generosity and in the faith that Christ will make us and the whole world well. Let's travel light with open arms for the love of God received and shared. Amen. Rise in body or spirit, and we sing the first two verses of Great Is Thy Faithfulness.